Ian, I can't tell you how thrilled I am to have you on the show. As I said in the introduction, you're probably one of the people that I look to as the epitome of leadership, and I mean that, and it's not a flattering comment. I work with a lot of leaders, and since I had the privilege to work in your organization at a company that you were the chief human resource officer for, I um I saw you both up close and I saw you from afar as well. And I really, really admire you. So I'm really thrilled to have you on the show today. And I can't wait to get your insights about all things leadership, but especially about change, because as I work with clients, and I know you are experiencing the same thing in your work, uh, that is the drumbeat. That is the heartbeat. Everybody's talking about change. I can't, everything's changing, everything's moving around us. So we're gonna have a great conversation. I'm looking forward to it. So before we even get started, I would love to introduce you because people don't know you. Uh, if you can just tell us a little bit about you and your leadership story, and who's Ian Ziskin and how did he get to be where he is today?
Yeah,
In a short form, right?
happy to do it. And of course, great to be with you. Thanks for the feedback. Back at you. I totally admire, everything you've done and I've seen you do, both in our corporate lives together, but also in building your own business and this podcast, which clearly has been doing great. No surprise to me. So it's an honor to be here. I think a little bit maybe in terms of background for your listeners. I'm somebody who's fortunate enough to have stumbled into a career and profession that I've loved. So the first 28 years of my career, for those who don't know me, I spent working in large companies, primarily in HR. Toward the latter part of my corporate life, I was the chief HR officer for two companies. Most recently, Northrop Grumman, which of course Janet, where you and I spent a lot of time, and loved my corporate life. Traveled all over the world, lived all over the United States, made every mistake you could make. Learned a few things along the way. A lot of variety during that 28-year period working for big companies. But I also had this somewhat entrepreneurial gene in me that kept popping out. So about 14 years ago, I launched my own coaching and consulting firm called EXec EXcel Group. And that has been a whole different but equally wonderful journey of entrepreneurship and building a business from scratch. And I spend a lot of time coaching senior leaders, do a lot of work in the leadership development space, meaning design, development, delivery of, teaching in various leadership programs. And I've written a bunch of books, which I've really enjoyed. We can talk more about that as we get into the conversation. And also something I didn't really expect to do when I launched my business, which is I've spent a fair amount of time now on boards of directors and advisory boards for smaller, more entrepreneurial kinds of companies. And in my big company life, I always knew entrepreneurs existed, but frankly, didn't get an opportunity to spend very much time with them. So that's a little bit about me.
What do you think has been your, I don't know, your secret sauce or your and secret sauce is a word from one of your books, obviously, but what do you think is your secret sauce to why you've been successful at this work?
I think it's maybe a combination of two things that are complementary. One is being an active learner, somebody who's always been willing to try new things, recognize that in trying new things, you're inevitably going to make mistakes, fail, trip over yourself, perhaps as much or more as you'll have success, and being okay with that, rather than letting it get in the way or discourage me from trying new things. That was particularly important, I think, as I was shifting from my corporate life to my entrepreneur life, running my own business, because I fully recognized that I had no idea whether I was going to be any good at or actually even enjoy running my own business, I figured out pretty quickly the only way to answer that question was to try it and not know if I was going to be successful. So I think that came from being an active learner. The other thing that I actually think has helped me a lot, I'm not sure how conscious or unconscious this has been, but it's been important to me over the course of my life and career, is collaboration and building a network and relationships with lots of other people. Because what I have found, both in my corporate life and in my more recent life running my own business, all of these relationships and the network that I've been fortunate enough to be able to build has really helped me in terms of being able to reach out to people who know more about things than I do, and I can learn from them. It's certainly been helpful in terms of building my business and developing a set of clients, where I have trust-based relationships. So I think the combination of those two things is what's really helped me to succeed to the extent that I've succeeded.
I'm going to take a shift because I know we don't have all day here to talk, because I could talk to you all day, but I wanted to talk a little bit about change. And you mentioned your story. There was a lot of change in it. I mean, you had a career, but you were dealing with change all the time, and you're helping leaders with change. You actually drove a lot of change initiatives in large organizations, which is hard. I mean, that's hard. And a lot of people listening are driving change initiatives, and it's hard. What do you think is the hardest part of driving organizational change?
Yeah, I try to address the question and the topic from two separate but related perspectives, if that's okay.
Yeah.
One is related to my own personal experience as a person and as a leader, but also I had the privilege of being the lead author on a book that came out a couple of years ago called The Secret Sauce for Leading Transformational Change. And so part of what I'm going to share with you in response to your question comes from what I learned from putting this book together and all of the people who contributed their wisdom and their mistakes in leading change as well. I think the first thing that's pretty consistent, frankly, with my own personal experience, but also all these other people I learned from, is the idea that human beings have this almost limitless capacity to deny, deflect, and dismiss facts or data that do not reinforce their preferred view of the internal or external environment. Whether you're an individual person or whether you work in an organization that has a culture that's highly receptive to input and information that's essential for success or survival, even if you don't like it, versus as an individual or organization where you basically spend all your time trying to filter out with blinders on information, facts, data that are contradictory to your preferred view. And the reason why that's so important is people and organizations collectively can waste a lot of time being in denial and not facing reality or explaining away why things are the way they are, rather than dealing with reality and taking action based on that reality. That is, if you were to say to me, what's the single most common underlying problem that gets in the way of successfully leading change, back to your question, that would be it.
What do you think is so hard for people, and ourselves included, right? Why do you think it's so hard for us to look at change or look at reality? Because you just mentioned reality, right? So we're denying reality. What's hard about that?
Well, one of the big ahas for me personally from writing the book was, if you're a student of change at all, like you are, or I am, you see a lot of stuff out there where people will inevitably ask the question, is it really true that people hate change? And at the risk of sounding cynical, my conclusion from my own experience, but also writing this book, is I actually do think that most people hate change. The only saving grace is that I think most people hate failure even more. So if you could focus in on helping people understand what it takes to win at the individual level, at the team level, certainly at the organizational level, to win in the marketplace or win in their own lives. I think I've concluded you have at least a 51% chance of getting people to be a little bit more comfortable, or if not comfortable, at least willing to go along for the ride or help lead change. Because the reason why there's so much discomfort or resistance, from what I see over and over again, is the fear and anxiety associated with giving up what you know, even if it's imperfect or in some cases failing and not working, in favor of letting go of that and trying something that's totally unknown. Therefore, there's risk, there's the opportunity to fail. But what ends up happening over and over again is you keep sticking with the stuff that doesn't work. Ironically, you have 100% chance of failure. And if you're willing to let go of some of those things that don't work or haven't worked well in the past and try some other things that might be smarter and more effective, you actually improve your chances of success and reduce your chance of failure. But most people have a hard time, especially rationally and emotionally, dealing with the idea of letting go of things that they're used to and comfortable with. And that's one of the big obstacles, I think, to successfully leading and sustaining change.
It's interesting as you talk, Ian. I I agree with everything you're saying, and I'm also thinking, wow, and that occurs at all levels, right? Even at the highest level leadership levels. And I know you've been instrumental in like really large scale changes from the top, like the top of a large, multi-billion dollar corporation.
One of the misconceptions, I think, is that change, particularly successful change, is led from the top
Right.
exclusively. And as it turns out, I've seen over and over again evidence that some people who have, or at least feel they have, the most to lose in a change are actually the people at the top, because they're now at the top. So
The
they got
power
here
of it, right?
now under the old system. They have a certain amount of power, influence that comes from being in a senior leadership role, and they don't necessarily want to give that up. So even though in theory they should be the ones with the broadest lens that are seeing all of the internal and external reasons that change is needed, they're also the ones who oftentimes resist most heavily. And the people who are multiple layers down in the organization, they may or may not like change, but one thing that they do see very clearly, especially if they're close to external customers, for example, are the things that are screwed up and not working well in the organization, and are generally highly frustrated by that. So in some ways, they're actually a little bit more open to trying some new things because they have great daily evidence that the things that are in place today are not working very well.
Right. And so, it's almost like you get this weird dynamic that goes on where, so I'm trying to influence change up also, right? And can't do that. Do you think that's possible? Can you influence change up?
I'm actually a firm believer in that. Again, one of the ahas for me in writing this book that I was mentioning before is that there is this misconception, I think, that change comes from leaders at the top of the organization. But in my experience, leadership in a broad sense, broadly defined, is actually much more important, because you can be a leader at any level, whether an individual contributor or you have a bunch of people working for you. You can actually help lead change, support change, drive the need for change, make it clear that there's a need for change, and in some ways do it in a more powerful way than more quote unquote senior people at the top of the organizational pyramid can. Why? Because you you have relationships with, and you're known by, and you have credibility with a lot of people throughout the organization, I tend to think of a lot of those people as influencers,
Right.
uh, and they're really important. And there's also this concept, which we can get into if you want, about resistors and where does the resistance come from, and overcoming this dynamic between people who can positively influence at any level, whether change happens or not, versus people who put a lot of energy into overtly or covertly trying to resist what's going on in an effort to make it fail. Understanding that dynamic is extremely important. And it doesn't only happen at the top of the organizational pyramid. A lot of that back and forth between positive influencers and resistors happens multiple layers down in the organization, and that has to be accounted for. I think a couple of principles that would be maybe helpful for people who are listening to us. One is I like to say, ignore the organization chart, because a lot of people, I think, make the mistake of launching a big change initiative, and the whole approach is really cascading it downward throughout the organizational hierarchy. So we have a tendency to start with the senior leadership team. And then if we can get everybody on board at that level, we try to get the next level on board, all with the very logical theory that if the top couple of layers of management understand what we're trying to do and get on board with change, everybody else in the organization works for them.
I'll
So
fall in
therefore,
line. Right.
so they'll fall in line, or it should cascade its way down. There's a certain legitimacy to that, but only to a point, because it actually turns out that, based on what we were just talking about a minute ago, leadership can come from any level, including people who are 9 layers down in the organization, who can be supporters or positively influence the change that you're trying to drive, or they can put their energy into resisting and be naysayers and quite negative. So if all you do in your change effort is focus on the organization chart and put all your energy on the people who are in the top couple of layers in the organization chart to get them on board, understand their concerns, communicate what the priorities are, and you forget about everybody else, assuming, as you said, they're going to fall in line, that's a huge mistake that I see a lot of organizations making. The second thing, which is kind of a corollary to the first, is one of the things we talk about in this book is the idea of love influencers and resistors. And why do I put it that way? Because a lot of people who are leading change, particularly senior level people, they come into an organization, and what they're really looking for themselves is positive reinforcement from the people around them that they're right in terms of the changes they're trying to make, and that everybody is on board and going to be supportive. And one of the ways they judge whether people are being supportive is they don't get too much pushback. They don't get a lot of negativity. They don't have people asking them hard questions that they don't want to answer. And when they do get some resistance or pushback, the natural tendency is to marginalize or get rid of or fire or ignore or all the above. Again, that's legitimate up to a point. But if you come in and you start firing people in the first 3 days that you're there, who you've concluded for whatever bad reasons are not on board, you're actually missing a really important aspect of effective leadership, of change, which is understanding who the resistors are at whatever level of the organization they might be, recognizing that generally they also have a lot of influence with people because they're credible, they've been there a long time, they understand the business, and they may simply be more willing to express concerns or ask hard questions that's on everybody's mind, but not everybody's willing to say those things. So if you are willing and comfortable as a leader to listen to those kinds of questions and hear the pushback, even if you don't like it, you'll get a much better appreciation for what the concerns are. And every once in a while, you'll actually learn something by virtue of the question or pushback that will help you adjust your change plan to be much more effective, because it's responsive to some of these concerns that people are raising. So
And people feel
bottom line of
heard.
all that,
And people also feel heard in it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, which is essential, right? Because we honestly we talk a lot about the importance of communication in leading change, just like communication is so important in many other aspects of running a business. But usually what people mean when they say communicate, communicate, communicate is they mean talk, 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 tell, tell, tell. You know, what they're really looking for is the senior leader to paint this compelling vision of the need for change and then go out and try to sell it to everybody else. Well, guess what? You know, as part of painting the compelling vision and selling it, you actually have to listen a lot more first, because most people in the organization can and will tell you what's screwed up and needs to be fixed if you're willing to listen to and value their input and make it safe for them to provide that input, rather than beating them up because they told you something negative that you didn't want to hear. That's, as I think we both know, the fastest way to cut off a good, valuable, useful input about what's broken, is if you beat up the people who are telling you what's broken.
How does vision play into all of this?
Well, you know, I was saying earlier, I've had some ahas from putting this book together myself. So I'm a firm believer that when you write a book, hopefully you're teaching people something, you know, that they find valuable. But I'm also a firm believer that you should learn things yourself as you're putting the book together. And one of the things I learned that was actually a pretty big aha for me is that as important as vision is, execution actually matters more. Because if you look at the energy level that a lot of leaders put into driving change, quite a bit of the upfront energy gets dissipated on, let's paint this compelling vision of the future, which is important, but it also leads people to this tell, 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 talk, 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 like we were talking about earlier. Uh, Equally important, probably more so, is how are we going to execute and, you know, double and triple check that we're actually step by step by step making progress and holding ourselves accountable, you know, for what progress is, and actually defining progress, rather than saying we're just going to change everything and hope it works. And therefore, the execution side of the equation matters quite a bit.
Yeah, in my experience, I couldn't tell you that I can tell you that I couldn't agree more with what you're saying, at least from what I observe. While I see so many people that I work with that are so visionary and they're so amazing in terms of painting the picture, part of where the struggle is okay, so how do we now make that into a strategy and a plan so that people can see and paint that realistically versus just keep grabbing birds as I talk. Here's a bird, here's a bird, here's a bird, right? It's
Well,
like, right, you know, when we've got all these birds, but they're all flying around. So,
to
yeah,
reinforce what you're saying, though, I think there's a subtext to this, which I think is really important. A lot of times people will ask the question, okay, I get it. You know, execution really matters a lot. But what does that look like? You know, how do we know we're putting in place a good approach to execution? And one of the things that I always say is a good execution plan has a lot of prioritization and
yes.
experimentation and piloting and testing stuff before you unleash it on the entire organization. So, you know, the translation of that is, you know, try to resist the temptation to change 100 things at a time. Because if you do that, even if those 100 things really need to be changed, you won't know which three mattered the most in terms of getting traction. Also, try to resist the temptation to change everything across the entire organization all at once, because generally speaking, if you do things in more digestible chunks, make it a little bit more bite-sized, try it out, see if it works, learn from it, and then eventually expand it, you'll minimize the risk of making large-scale mistakes in favor of making smaller mistakes that you can learn from. And then eventually, once you've learned from those mistakes, you can inflict whatever it is you're trying to implement on the broader organization but minimize the chance of turning the entire place upside down simultaneously, which is much more difficult to come back from.
Yeah, I can't tell you how wise that comment is, right? Because we both have seen the repercussions, and I'm sure everybody listening has been involved in the repercussions of that, where everything gets turned upside down and then people just go back to whatever it is. I mean, that happens in our personal lives too, right? When you want to, I don't know, get fit or change your diet or whatever it is. If I'm never going to eat this again, and I'm never going to do this, and I'm going to do all of these things at once, most likely in a few weeks you'll have stopped, right? And nothing will change. Whereas if the incremental approach of prioritizing what I'm going to do, well, I'm going to stop eating sugar, or I'm going to whatever it is, it's so much easier. I mean, it applies.
And one of the biggest, most prominent competing priorities that I've seen over and over again is this reconciliation of facts versus feelings. Here's what I mean by that. So on the facts side, you heard me say earlier that people have this, limitless capacity to, deny, deflect, dismiss, explain away facts or data that they don't like. Well, that's true in this context of leading change. For example, almost everybody can relate to the idea of getting on a scale, and looking down at the numbers. Those are the facts. Looking down at the numbers and saying,
But the scale is broken, Ian. Don't you understand?
well, hopefully the scale's broken. If it isn't,
Well, that's what we do, right? It's like we deny the facts.
I might need to lose some weight, right?
Right.
But one of the things we know is if all you do is keep pointing down at the scale and expecting the numbers to change by themselves, they won't. The data just by themselves are not compelling enough, even though you might want to change, to actually execute change. What we know now is that usually it's some combination of diet and exercise, or maybe these days, people who are taking Ozempic, or all the equivalent drugs that people are trying out that lead to some version of weight loss. It's not just staring down at the data. And
There's action.
yeah, and so therefore you have to also appeal to what I describe as feelings, what's in people's heads, what's in their hearts, in terms of embracing the need for whatever change is, including losing weight. You have to sign up for and take some sustained action over a period of time that will lead to the change in the data. And one of the bigger mistakes I think a lot of senior level leaders make, especially when they're more analytical kind of people, is they believe, well, if I just keep pointing to the facts, to the data that suggest the need for change, our financial performance is not good enough, or our customer satisfaction and net promoter scores are not good enough, therefore, isn't it obvious that we must change? That doesn't get it done. You also have to be able to appeal to what's in people's heads and hearts to get them to be motivated to diet and exercise and lose the weight, rather than you just keep pointing at their scale saying, you're 10 pounds too heavy and things need to change. That's usually not going to work, and it's not going to be sustainable.
Yeah. What are some final words that you would give us, or any words of wisdom that you haven't mentioned that you think is really important to this topic?
Yeah, I think one would be that there's this other fallacy which I've seen repeated over and over again, that somehow successful change is about being able to anticipate the need, see around corners, connect dots between seemingly disconnected things so that you can project out into the future even before it's obvious the need for change. And to the degree that you can be, that proactive and forward thinking, that's great. But it actually turns out there's as many, if not more, examples of we didn't see it coming, we weren't prepared for it, we didn't know where it was coming from. COVID's probably a great example of this, which nobody saw coming before it got here. But it certainly pointed out the need and caused people to recognize the value of agility, moving quickly, defining reality, not not denying it, so that you can quickly adjust your game plan to respond to the things that are happening around you, most of which you don't control. So a lot of organizations, I think, put energy into, or try to be more anticipatory about the need for change, and completely forget about the fact that once something hits you from an unexpected place, you actually have to have a capacity in your organization to be very agile and quickly turn to it. One of my favorite quotes that relates to this, but comes from a very different place, is Mike Tyson, who many people may remember as a heavyweight boxing champion. He was being interviewed by a member of the media prior to one of his big bouts. And the question to Mike Tyson was, "What's your strategy for the fight?" And his response was, "Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth." And I think that's really true for organizations too, because quite often we had a plan. We thought we were going to do something to create big change, but then we get punched in the mouth. It comes from a place we didn't expect. And what's our response to that? That responsiveness is equally, if not more important, to having a plan and the ability to anticipate the need for change before it actually comes at you.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think that's the thread in what you've been talking about this whole episode is flexibility, right? Being able to be flexible as well. So I think that's a thread, at least that I'm pulling out of this.
Yeah, no, I'd certainly reinforce that. I'm glad it's coming through if that's what you're taking
Yeah.
conversation, because I certainly feel very strongly about that.
Yeah. So, Ian, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I know that this episode will be really valuable to so many people listening, because we're all dealing with, both personally and in our organizations, we're dealing with change. And just your insights, I know will be very helpful. So thank you very much for spending time with us.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.